you know who the next Andrew W. Mellon lecturer in the fine arts is? Anna DeVere Smith, the noted art historian, widely published in peer-reviewed journals. Yes, I'm going to go down and listen to a couple, and there may be a little commentary. But it's just so ridiculous.
Well,
Director of. Yeah.
Anyway, she's strong.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, it must be a complete nightmare.
But the National Gallery,
Yeah. Well, I know lots of people have left. What is her area?
she's not easy.
Okay.
She did the very good Guggenheim.
Okay.
Very smart. And a lovely person.
Such a pity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Yes.
What a really wonderful turnout. It's great to see you all here. Thank you. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Fall 2023 Evening Lecture Series. We have an exciting panel discussion tonight about Matisse's sculpture, The Serf. A reminder to those of you here on 8th Street to please silence all of your cell phones. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the Clay Room for light refreshments. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 23-24 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. I'm excited to share that our annual benefit is coming up on Thursday, October 19th. We still have tickets available for the cocktail hour and free. Now, I'm delighted to briefly introduce our panelists this evening in the order of speaking, I believe. Eric Gibson is the Arts and Review Editor of the Wall Street Journal and one of the paper's art critics, in which capacity he has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. He is the author of The Necessity of Sculpture, Selected Essays in Criticism, 1985 to 2019. He wrote on Matisse's backs for the December 2021 issue of the new Criterion. Garth Evans is a sculptor who has presented work in over 100 solo and group exhibitions, including a survey exhibition at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which coincided with the publication of Garth Evans' sculpture Beneath the Skin. Evans has received numerous awards and residencies, including a fellowship with the British Steel Corporation and a Guggenheim Fellowship. His work is represented in major public and private collections, including Tate Britain, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the British Museum. In 2018, Evans began Sculpture Forum, a project that promotes the discussion of sculpture amongst sculptors. and with educators, critics, and other artists. William Tucker is a sculptor and a writer on sculpture. His work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and it can also be seen in public spaces in Scotland, England, South Korea, Spain, Argentina, and the United States. His most recent exhibition, Portraits and Masks, was held at the Buchmann Gallery in Berlin in 2022. A collection of his writings will be published in 2024. Karen Wilkin is a curator and critic who has organized exhibitions internationally and written extensively on David Smith, Anthony Caro, Isaac Witkin, John Gibbons, Vincent Barre, and Tim Scott, among other sculptors. And she's written about Henri Matisse's use of sculpture in his paintings. A regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, and the Hudson Review, she teaches in the New York Studio School's MFA program. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to our speakers.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for coming. I'm here to direct traffic tonight, so I'm going to do my best to stay out of everybody's way, but I wanted to open with a few words of explanation as to how it is we all happen to be here tonight. Several months ago, possibly it's a couple of years ago, Bill and I were having an email exchange, and he mentioned that he'd become very intrigued with Le Serf and had what he thought were some pretty interesting ideas. And I said, well, look, why don't you write it up for one of our masterpiece columns, which is a roughly 800-word essay that appears every Saturday in the review section of the journal, in which a writer focuses on a single work of art. He said, fine, and I didn't hear anything for quite a long time. And then I think in January of this year, he sent me the completed essay, which, as you will discover, was terrific. There was just one problem. It was 5,000 words. So we can trim, but we can't trim something like that without butchering it. So I bounced him over to the New Criterion, and then he came up with the idea for this panel built around it. So that's why we're here. As you heard, we're going to watch a video of Bill and Garth discussing the sculpture. Then Garth will share his reflections on that experience. Bill will discuss Le Serf and what he's found. Karen will then talk about sculpture, Matisse's sculpture in his own paintings, and then we'll open it to the floor for a Q&A. So without further ado, let's have the video.
Really cut these thighs down.
Yeah.
This one. Cut right off there.
Mm-hmm. You know, playing like this, I mean, I think he might have done it with a cheese cutter. This right shoulder blade is just a lump. It doesn't really correspond to anything.
Doesn't correspond to anything.
Except to the left-hand side of the belly. You know, the left-hand side is really pushing out.
Yeah. Well, it's extraordinary that cut in here. You know, it would be, you know, that hollow there.
Yeah. Well, he cut that, and then he put this back on top of it, and then he cut that again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
there's no anatomical explanation for that.
No, he wasn't, he'd stopped working from the model.
Yeah. But I mean, if you have a knowledge of anatomy, it's hard to disregard it so blatantly.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, he was pretty free.
once the model had gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the model had this very distinctive hump on his back. But I think this looks like he's describing a circular form here. You can even see marks, sort of like drawing marks, where he's distorted the line of the spine.
Yeah, because the spine here is coming up through here.
Yeah,
And then suddenly it jumps over to here.
yeah.
Seems to make sense to come down through, to come out this far. His neck disappears on this side. His neck simply disappears.
Yes, there are these two holes that are really, he really excavated those two places. And it seems to me that he very likely was trying to find the armature in order to change the shape, the direction of the head. I never noticed before how small the left shoulder is, the muscle of the left shoulder in relation to the right. Mm-hmm. He's not thinking about these as arms anymore. He's thinking about this as a mass with sub-masses in it.
Yeah.
Well, having said it doesn't need arms, then it becomes, something completely different. You're liberated.
It is fascinating, though, isn't it, that you do not miss the arms somehow.
No, and it looked like when he finished, it looked like the picture.
And you
and
think
so
so?
then he could have worked really fast. It doesn't take long to take off big areas with a knife.
Right, but the sense that he'd worked on it for so long, you'd think he'd had some investment in keeping what he'd done. He just threw it out.
Yeah, but
Same
it's
time.
interesting that he kept that photograph. I mean, that would have been like the first stage of Jeanette, one of the Jeanette heads, So he made a thing about keeping the photograph, and then changed it completely.
It is astonishing, and I mean, the more one looks at it, the more astonishing it becomes, and at the same time, it grows in impact.
Yeah.
I mean, the overall impact of the thing is tremendous, but once you begin to kind of interrogate it in any kind of detail, it's astonishing.
Oh, can we watch that one too? All right, Garth, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric. First, I must thank Bill for including me in this project, and thank you, Bill. Next, I need to thank Maud Britt for arranging our visit. For arranging our visit to the Fogg store to look at this cast. And for the excellent video that Maud made while we were there. Thank you, Maud. The visit was on May 5th this year, and it was, for me, a great privilege to spend 2 hours looking intensely alongside Bill at this singular work. The visit confirmed for me a sense that the reworking of this figure, once the model had left and the arms were removed, was an act of great daring, and that it laid the foundation for the sculpture that Matisse would make later in life. One of the things that really interests me, and we don't know, is over what period of time that reworking took place. Was it all done in a single furious session, or over a period of time with several sessions with intervals of days or perhaps weeks in between? Bill, in his essay, suggests that it was a fairly short period of time. I wonder if it could have been a single furious session. I think it's possible. One of the other things I found myself thinking about when we were looking at the cast in Somerville was about the way that now that the work is in bronze, it conveys, as any work in bronze does, it conveys a sense of finality and permanence, and somehow that's somewhat misleading. I mean, I think the work, struck me as quite open and fresh and dynamic and in some kind of sense unfinished. The issue is clearly when you're working from the figure in clay, once the model had gone and the arms were gone, the artist was liberated from the obligation to make a portrait, liberated from being mindful of the human presence that was his source. Now, in these circumstances, it is possible, when deprived of the source, to be unable to find a meaningful way to proceed. I've had this experience. And in teaching, I have found it is common for students to be unable to find a way to proceed once the model is gone. Clearly, this was not the case for Matisse. It's remarkable, in fact, that, given the investment that he'd made, the amount of time he'd spent working from the model, that once the model had gone, he was able to essentially attack the thing he'd made. The figure that we looked at, that cast, it almost ceased to be a portrait of a particular man, although a workman, although it is that, very powerfully that. But it struck me as having become, I don't know, a kind of a metaphor for being alive. I mean, it seems really very vital. How did Matisse accomplish this? We spoke about it, and we can only speak about what he did, where he cut material away, where he put material on, and so on. And much of this has to be speculation. We have no direct comparison between the bronze cast and the original clay figure. I found myself asking, what made him do it? What inspired him? Or was it an act of desperation? Because he'd had the clay figure professionally photographed, we may assume, I think, that he was not, totally dissatisfied with it and perhaps had no intention of doing anything with it other than having it cast. But something happened. And what? I like the idea that it began with an accident, in which the arms came off, although I think that's improbable. And it's more probable that the arms were carefully removed for casting, for ease of casting, so they would be cast separately and then reattached to the figure later. it would seem that the absence of the arms and with the model gone, Matisse saw something, some possibility, and he was brave enough to attack the thing that he had labored on for so long. I think that was an act of great courage and something we should be grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Garth. Bill, over to you.
Turn the phone off.
So the Serf was Matisse's first figure and his second sculpture. It's the only figure of the male body from observation of the body in his entire oeuvre. He made 2 or 3 more small male figures from classical, like from an écorché and a thorn extractor. And then, of course, he made the crucifix for the Vence Chapel late in his life. Those are the 4 male figures he made. Of course, all the rest of his figures are from the female body. So it's completely, the Serf is his first figure, and it's completely unlike any other sculpture that he made. He was working on it, he'd been working on it for 3 years in sessions with Bevilacqua, the model, by the time this photograph was taken. And it seems that the photograph was, it was definitely finished. He had several copies made of the photograph to give to collectors, and he was just ready to cast it. The 2 others he's holding, Madeleine 1, and the sculpture behind him on the modeling stand is a portrait of an old woman. That is, this represents the end of 3 years' work. And what Garth was talking about, the work that he did, we'll get to that later, because it's my suggestion, and it hasn't been, this is completely my idea of what happened. So here's the figure after 3 years' work. His first sculpture was this, a copy of the Barye's jaguar devouring a hare. And this was really a revelation to him to work in clay. And he describes how he copied Barye's sculpture blind, using his hand, getting the feel of a form by touching the model, eyes closed, and then doing the same for my work, gauging it like that. That same year, we're talking 1899, he acquired this painting by Cézanne. And he, in his, the notes of a painter in 1908, he wrote, "Look instead at one of Cézanne's pictures. All is so well arranged that no matter at what distance you stand and how many figures are represented, you will always be able to distinguish each figure clearly and to know which limb belongs to which body. This is, of course, a critique of Rodin, but it also points the way to his attitude towards sculpture, that you need to distinguish the figure clearly, and no matter at what distance you stand. And I would add to that, in what direction you stand, because the sculpture can be viewed from 360 degrees and from near and from far. And he was really conscious of the sculpture as something to be looked at. This is the model. This painting is at MoMA, male nude, and the date of it is 1900. It was painted in Carrier's studio. Carrier was the friend of Rodin and Bourdelle, and Matisse went from Carrier's studio to Bourdelle's academy. Bourdelle, who was chief assistant to Rodin at the time, was running this, basically, a sculpture school. And Matisse went there and started work on the Serf, building an armature for it. It was based on Rodin's John the Baptist. The pose is based on Rodin's John the Baptist. And this is John the Baptist in plaster, taken in Rodin's studio in about 1880. This is the model who arrived at Rodin's studio. His name was Cesare Pignatelli. And Rodin wrote much later about how this guy had arrived at his studio. This rough, hairy man exuded such an air of violence and physical strength, but also the mystical element of his people. I thought immediately of John the Baptist, which is to say, a man who lives amid nature, a visionary, a believer, a precursor, who has come to announce the advent of someone greater than himself. So actually, Pignatelli was much more sophisticated than Rodin had noticed at the time, and immediately had these photographs taken of himself in the pose of John the Baptist. He posed for a number of sculptures by Rodin, and then simultaneously or soon after started to build a career for himself, working for all the other artists, including mostly academic artists, successful salon artists, who Rodin really hated and despised. And eventually, we don't know exactly when, Rodin got so furious with him, he publicly described him in an interview as a terrifying fellow, capable of cruelty, with the maliciousness of a civilized being and the cunning of a savage. The glint in his eyes was like that of a wild beast at night, and when he smiled, he resembled a wolf. I think that outburst must have been triggered by the fact that Pignatelli was having such success with the salon artists, when he owed, from Rodin's point of view, he owed his reputation in Italy to Rodin, having modeled him for John the Baptist. The Walking Man was Rodin's first study for John the Baptist. And those are Pignatelli's legs. The torso is completely different, and you can see it's very crudely joined at the waist. Rodin was actually working on this from about 1877 continuously until right up to the time of his great retrospective exhibition in 1900. And Matisse would have seen that show, but by the time Matisse saw it, he was already at work on the Serf. So the pose, the pose he got from John the Baptist, from the model who had posed for John the Baptist. Although at this time he'd changed his name from Pignatelli to Bevilacqua. This is the enlarged version of the Walking Man that Rodin was also working on in the period about 1903, 1905. So actually, Rodin was working on the Walking Man at exactly the same time as Matisse was working on the Serf. And Matisse finished the Serf before Rodin exhibited the enlarged Walking Man in 1907. So this photograph is the only real evidence that we have in terms of photography of what was going on in his Matisse's studio at the time. You can see, first of all, you can see it's very overexposed. The light was very poor, obviously. Matisse is holding a plaster cast that kind of fades into his shirt of Madeleine I, and behind him is the bust of the old woman. This sculpture is very rarely seen. I've only seen it once in the late 60s. And also in that photograph was this painting known as A Monk in Meditation. That is a portrait of Pignatelli, now Bevilacqua, and actually his features are very distinctive, and you can really see this very long, narrow nose, and so he was also definitely known as the wolf in Rodin's studio. Finally, we have this painting at the Tate called Studio Interior, or Corner of the Studio. And on top of the armoire that was blocking the doorway in the studio shot, to prevent him being interrupted during this, what must have been a very long exposure, which explains why he's standing there so awkwardly. And he obviously didn't know, just holding on to the cast of Madeleine I, because he just didn't know where to put it down. So he was just kind of frozen there for a minute or two. On top of the armoire that was blocking the doorway, you can see the plaster cast, which is the only representation of the plaster cast of the Serf. To me, it looks as though it does not have arms, but that's pretty much a matter of opinion. In front of it is the plaster of the bust of an old woman, and the white shape on the left of that is the cast of the jaguar. And I think down on the floor on the left of the armoire is the mold of Madeleine I, and then in front of that the model for Madeleine II that's wrapped in, looks like it's wrapped in wet rags. So now I'm going to say something about how this all happened. There was a rumor of Matisse himself, first of all, did not say anything later about, or didn't say anything about the accident. But there was an accident. There must have been an accident, because the fact that it did not have arms after this photograph was distributed with arms obviously aroused quite a bit of interest and speculation. And certainly it did later. When Matisse's daughter, Marguerite, was asked about it, she said she thought that the accident occurred at the foundry. And that means that, I mean, this just seems so unlikely to me, but it doesn't disqualify the fact that there must have been an accident. And my idea of it is that the accident occurred when Matisse went to in order to cast a sculpture.
Do you want to go back?
Yeah. In order to cast the sculpture, he would have had to have lowered the sculpture down to a lower base. He could not have done it on this high modeling stand. He had to have lowered it and had someone help lower it. And what I think happened was that as he was lowering it onto a lower table, such as the table you can just see over on the right of the picture, that the sculpture became unbalanced, and there had been two people to do it. It was very heavy and top heavy, and so I think what happened was that the sculpture started to fall, and it would have fallen completely had whoever was helping him, or Matisse himself, not grabbed the right arm, and so it arrested the fall, but the arm came away from the thigh of where the hand was resting. And you can actually see he preserved this in the sculpture. Now, if you see on the right-hand side, you can really see the hole that was left, and looking end on here, you can just about see how deep it was. So there are other holes, similar holes, and that those are completely unexplained. Nobody has people have talked a lot about this sculpture, but nobody seems to have noticed the holes. Nobody's mentioned them that I've read. And there are actual two more holes like this at the base of the neck of the sculpture. You can just about see right here on either side of the neck are two more deep, similar holes. And it looks to me that what Matisse is doing is probing the clay. Of course, it's still in clay, and trying to find out where the armature is, because the armature is that he made originally in Bordel's studio is so well made and so rigid that what has tended to happen over the 3 years that he was working on it, it's supporting a lot of clay. But because he couldn't do anything about removing the clay from the legs, because it's actually, you know, he couldn't do anything about lengthening the legs like Rodin did with the Walking Man. Rodin has the John the Baptist and the Walking Man were both made on an external armature. So the sculpture is basically floating there, and he can, like he did, he lengthened the trailing leg of the Walking Man by a couple of inches. But Matisse was not in a position to do that because the armature was just so solid. And so it tended to accumulate more and more clay on basically on the top of anything above the waist, and especially as you got to get up to the head and shoulders, there's more and more clay there. So those, I think, were the actual circumstances of the accident in Matisse's studio. And it's very possible that Matisse, when Matisse mentioned it, when it actually occurred, I think he would have naturally been very distraught about it. And he probably said something to his wife or daughter. His daughter was only 9. And there was so much going on in his studio. And we're talking about, you know, this is the period of, you know, Matisse is leader of the avant-garde in Paris. He's got, the whole fauve revolution has taken place. So, there was not much attention being made to the Serf, which wasn't exhibited in bronze until 1908. So I think that Marguerite just misremembered. She remembered there was an accident. There was a rumor about that time. Hans Perman, Matisse's student, who organized the short-lived academy with Sarah Stein, Hans Perman thought that the accident, Hans Perman had actually been looking at the plaster of the Serf, studying it in Sarah Stein's studio in the period from he arrived in Paris in 1906, and he was studied it in 6 and 7 before the sculpture was sent away to be cast. He was studying the Serf in plaster without arms. He thought, he sort of speculated that the arms might have come off in an accident when Matisse moved studios in 1905, the year before Perman had arrived in Paris. So I'm sure there was an accident, and this seems to me the most reasonable explanation for it.
Do you mind if I hand it over to Karen?
You're at your
Yeah, I
last
just
slide.
want-
He's got his last slide.
Okay. I'm trying to keep this short. So the important thing that he thought about casting the sculpture. He planned to cast the sculpture. The arm, one arm came off in the modeling stand. If he was consulting a professional mold maker, a mold maker would have pointed out that this was not a big problem because that space between the arm and the trunk of the figure was going to be very hard to cast, and the easiest solution would be to remove the arms and then and cast them separately. So I believe that's what happened, that he carefully removed the other arm and then got ready to cast the figure. But as he looked at the figure without arms, he realized that he was actually seeing it for the first time. He could see around it. The arms had been totally in the way of getting a sense of the sculpture as a completely full three-dimensional form that's really with three elements. You've got the base, the legs up to the hips, and then the entire top section, which is a unit in itself. You can see around it. He saw around it for the first time. And so he realized this sculpture is not finished at all. So he then set to work to rework it completely. And you can see how radical his working was, how he used the knife and all this. So the connection between the removal of the arms and then the subsequent reworking of the sculpture, nobody's talked about this before, but it seems to me absolutely obvious. The sculpture is still in clay. It has to be in clay. The problem is there's no, but on the other hand, it had to have been in plaster to be exhibited. It was in plaster when we saw it on the top of the armoire in his studio. It had to have been in plaster when it was exhibited for the first time in 1904 and again in 1906. And this again it can't be verified, but it was in Sarah Stein's living room with her collection of recent Fauve and other paintings, recent paintings by Matisse. And but there are no pictures of the plaster with or without arms. There are no pictures of the plaster. So,
Bill?
Yep.
I think we need to wrap it up so Karen can
Okay.
speak and then we can do questions.
So I'm just going to conclude it there. Thank you.
All right. Oops, sorry about
Thank you,
that.
Bill. Well, this kind of radical reworking, which is clearly a very daring and important step, is something that Matisse continues to do in his paintings. He often does two versions of something. Well, what if I did this? And I would argue that there's a relationship between that kind of rethinking and what happens in the way he uses his own sculpture and other people's sculpture in his paintings. Now, the most obvious place to start is the Red Studio, which we all had a wonderful chance to spend time with its components last year. And it's an itemization of everything in the studio, I think, that he was most proud of at the time that he painted the painting, which includes a number of sculptures, obviously, including the one little one on the table, which they found the original of, not expecting to. But you have these two, Jeannette IV and the decorative figure, who are reproduced. I don't think Matisse is exploring the form of that sculpture as much as in painting in two dimensions as he is as I say, taking inventory of what was going on in the studio. But there's another way he was using sculpture in the paintings. And that starts with this very early painting about 1895 when he was in the studio of Gustave Moreau. And here is the model filling the center of the painting, being rhymed with that plaster cast of the sculpture in the background. It may be significant that neither of the two people that are shown drawing or painting is facing either the live model or the sculpture. But the significant thing for me is the juxtaposition of the human model reproduced and the sculpture. It's as though Matisse is telling us something that we should be looking out for in the future. The relationship between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional is extremely obvious in this very well-known, wonderful painting that's in Baltimore, the fruit of his first trip to North Africa. Of course, it is highly influenced by the Michelangelo Dawn, which we know he had a reproduction of in the studio. He'd seen it in the flesh. And this becomes sort of folded into the same pose of Aurora, Dawn, in 3 dimensions as in the Souvenir Biscla. And she turns up all the time. He paints this sculpture over and over again. Maybe it's like the kind of cutting into the Serf after he decides that the arms are not necessary. He's altering the shape of the sculpture. He's finding new profiles without having to actually work on it in 3 dimensions. He can do this by painting it. It's no longer taking inventory in the same way. It's using this, I would say, as a surrogate for the human model, for the human being. It's as though not having the live person, but having the live person already translated into the work of art is liberating. Now, towards the end of his life, Matisse said he liked having this model in the studio for the frisson, for the charge. He was a lot younger in 1912. Maybe the frisson was coming from something else. But you see how this gets repeated and altered each time. Look how radically he shifted the relationship of the breasts. And I think this is something that allows him to then, when he goes back to doing it in 3 dimensions, be extremely audacious with the figure. He's tried out other things in 2 dimensions. He plays with the scale. Here is the reclining figure, the Aurora, as a monumental figure by a pond seen out the window, with Madame sitting in the garden while his children are indoors. Now, that sculpture was never that big. You've all seen it. It's about so long. But here it becomes a monumental piece which is dwarfing his wife in the garden. So this working on the sculpture as a painting allows him to make a very radical transformation. At the same time that he's giving reproducing a painting that we know very well, the music teacher sitting on the stool on the right. And that pose turns up again, fragmented, rearranged in the late series of the gouache coupé of the blue nudes. That sculpture that we saw in the Moreau studio has its counterpart. This is the same year as Red Studio. There's the decorative figure. He's taking inventory of luxe comme et volupté there. And there on the right is a piece of the study for the dance, which took up a lot of room in the studio. The finished work went off to Wilkin, and the study stayed in the studio, and turns up in a lot of paintings. Here, one that's at the Met, and it becomes something that is a repeated motif. It turns up all the time. Again, not the live model. the image of the live model already translated into a work of art. So you see how there's just that fragment of it which is rhymed with the sculpture and with another painting or drawing, and it's also rhymed with that figured cloth, with that very dramatic pink on blue, like the study for the dance, which also becomes a dominant motif in the paintings. And I think there's this transformation from the live model to the sculpture to the fabric, that this becomes surrogates for the figure that he's exploring in 2 dimensions, having already explored them in the 3 dimensions. That back and forth, that finding of new profiles, that finding of new possibilities, that is the same impulse to cut into the Serf and transform it, is continuous. And we'll see it throughout Matisse's life.
Very good. Thank you, Karen.
Do we have? No.
You should.
Well, we have time for questions?
Do we have time for questions?
We absolutely do. Please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over.
Thanks. I'm wondering if anybody knows about, I understand that Matisse met and showed drawings of his to Rodin sort of right before he began work on the Serf. And I'm wondering if there's a connection. Is Bevilacqua somehow a sort of substitute for Rodin?
No, he did not. He was already at work on the Serf. Matisse would have seen Rodin's show, his big centennial show, opened 1st of June, 1900. Matisse's painting of the model of Bevilacqua, that's at MoMA, that was painted very early in 1900, because so the pose, Matisse's pose, his choice of Bevilacqua as the model for John the Baptist, and Matisse's pose of the model as John the Baptist, or derived from John the Baptist, that happened very early in 1900. So he actually went to show his drawings to Rodin very unwillingly, because when he really didn't want to meet people who had been his teachers, they always failed him. And when he actually met them personally, so he said he did not want to meet Cézanne. Cézanne was a god of painting, the one painting who remained, his teacher through his paintings. He didn't want to meet him.
Well, also, Rodin didn't like Matisse's drawings, and essentially said, there, keep doing it, maybe you'll get better. And there's a late interview with Matisse, when he's already an institution and internationally admired, when he says how harmful it can be to a young artist who gets bad advice from somebody. He's still annoyed with Rodin at this point.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But he prepared for that visit to Rodin by a drawing of a short pose. And so he knew in advance what was going to happen, and so he was covered,
It
So
also didn't
Rodin
stop
said,
him.
you need to make more detailed drawing, But that wasn't, he didn't want to make a detailed drawing. So, but his relationship with Rodin was always, kind of weird. Because
Well,
he was very influenced by Rodin's sculpture.
Do you remember when John Elderfield put the Serf next to the Rodins in the People show before one of the before the Taniguchi renovation of MoMA? And it was a great moment because you could see they had the nude study for Balzac and the Serf and one or two other Rodins. So you had this direct comparison between the way Rodin treated the surface, which was still, for all of the sense of touch, very much about the internal structure of the body, and Matisse's moving into some other territory.
Yes, what Matisse described as muscle and imitation.
Yes, exactly.
We have an online question about the title, The Serf. Was it titled by Matisse? And could you just speak a little bit more to the title?
Well, Matisse is a young man. It's a revelation to me to read about in Hilary Sperling's biography about what a rebel he was, and at that age. And it seems to me that, well, to start with, it's the only sculpture of his that has that kind of title inscribed on it. My explanation for that is that it happened in Bordel's Academy. There were a number of clay figures that were probably from the same model, that were being worked on. They would all have been wrapped in rags, wet rags. And so in order to identify his figure, he inscribed this title on the base, so that you'd only just need to lift up the rags at the base to see that this was Matisse's sculpture. As for the title, I think it's really ironic that he didn't call it the Slave. He called it The Slave late in life, and it's listed in the Catalogue Raisonné as an alternative title. But at that stage, I think it would have been very pretentious, thinking of the Michelangelo slaves in the Louvre, for him to have called it The Slave. But I think the title is, the emancipation of the serfs happened about the same time as the emancipation of the slaves here. It was a relatively recent event, and someone who he met...
45 years.
What?
About 40 years.
Well, yes, but a serf and a slave were people, they weren't, the slave, could be thought of not as what we now know of slaves in the United States. They were classical slaves, which were basically prisoners of war. And
You have another question.
I'm glad to go after that question about the title, because my question or comment involves Michelangelo's Slave. And I wanted to start by saying that great things you've shown us come from accidents sometimes. So he didn't maybe intend to cut off the arms, but once he saw them off, maybe he embraced it. And it reminds me of something that happened to Gaston Lachaise once when he exhibited his plasters. There was a fall and then another fall, and he made the most of it. But the slave, I was wondering if there might be some symbolism in his cutting off the arms, because when I was thinking about Michelangelo's dying slave, I thought it's the complete opposite here, and there's something like ecstatic about the dying slave and beautiful, but in this serf, his body is downtrodden. Matisse has removed his means. The hands are your means, and I wondered if there was some symbolism in his being, losing his hands.
I don't think, this is so unusual in Matisse's work to have a kind of allegorical title. And I think at the time, I think that there was an element of irony in it. To start with, the idea that you would depict a serf with no clothes on. I mean, it's ridiculous for John the Baptist to be depicted with no clothes on. But it's even more ridiculous to depict a serf who was, you know, in recent memory, with no clothes on. There were a whole vogue for statues of workers going on. They were all in costume, the costume of their trade. So I think this fellow Goldberg, who an anarchist philosopher and critic, who came from Eastern Europe, I think he kind of suggested this as a title. Because the title, if he'd actually called it The Slave, L'Esclave, it would have looked really awkward. Whereas Le Serf, with the S right in the middle of that plaque, that is really much more Matisse.
Hi, thank you all. I was just curious, that lump on the right scapula of the serf, that seems sort of mysterious, but there was a lump on the left scapula of the walking man, and then that other sort of lower down, big patchy thing on the walking man. I was wondering if there was any just formal connection or some sort of homage, any kind of relationship there. Thanks.
Are you talking about the joint, which is actually at the sort of right across the butt?
Above, on the walking man, above
the walking man.
Above the butt on the right was a sort of a lumpy thing, but there was also a little something on his left scapula, I thought, that, you know, if we're all mystified by that lump on the right, on the serf.
Well, there's a huge hole in the middle of the walking man's back, and that is where the external armature came into the middle of the back. I can't really identify what you're talking about.
I just wanted to add a few things because I did a long time ago write on Matisse, and I remember reading that Matisse went to Rodin one time even curious about thinking of doing sculpture, and he didn't like the idea that Rodin worked in parts, you know, a foot, or he wanted the entirety, the wholeness of things, and he felt Bourdelle would give more of a complete form rather than having to break up into details. He didn't like any concept of details, which probably explains a little bit of his love of the arabesque. And also when you were showing, Karen, the odalisque figures, I thought also of de Chirico's Ariadne on all the piazzas of Italy with that continual pose, and also his Moroccan experiences. So it's very interesting, you know, all those analogies. But I do remember that the detail of parts and the whole were very important for Matisse.
I think that's absolutely right. That I'll just briefly read you what Matisse wrote in Notes of a Painter. I could mention a great sculptor who gives us some admirable pieces, but for him a composition is merely a grouping of fragments, which results in a confusion of expression. Look instead at one of Cézanne's pictures. All is so well arranged that I don't have to go through that again. So Matisse's critique of Rodin was always that he focused on detail. He didn't have a sense of the whole. He would take the hand of a figure, and when it was still in clay, and he would rework it, and then he'd put the hand back on the figure, and then he would change the arm that was attached to the hand, and so on. So it took him so long to finish anything because he was always, he was always rearranging the parts. Whereas Matisse had to have a conception of the whole from the beginning.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a comment, or this may be entirely incidental. However, I know that Moreau's teacher wrote a book called Training the Memory in Art. I believe his name was Baudrillard. And he had classes in which his students would only look at the model. They could not draw, they could not paint until the model left the room. And I know that he taught Moreau, and of course Moreau taught Matisse. So I thought it's a rather kind of interesting thread that runs through some ways of thinking. It is, the book, Training the Memory in Art, is quite fascinating. And he was very influential at the time. So.
Well, I mean, Moreau was a marvelous teacher to start with for Matisse. Moreau got his students to the Louvre and had them copy paintings there, which they could sell. I mean, because they could sell the paintings to the copies that they made. They could sell them to provincial museums because, well, that was the age before, color photography.
Great. Well, I'm conscious of time. So thank you all very much for our conversation tonight. Thank you to our panelists. And again, please join us downstairs in the clay room to continue the conversation and ask those questions we didn't get to.
But if you want to play in the clay room, you can.
Okay, I've got a slideshow here. After yours, there was a second slideshow. Let's put it up now.